in this context, translates into non-being. Which captures the idea that its absences are things not being somewhere. Okay. So one particular group of thinkers have a pretty strong view about absence. So these are the Nyaya thinkers. They accept realism, which is the view that absences exist in a stance-independent manner, independently of our attitudes, and they are non-reductionists. They say that absences that exist in this way cannot be reduced to other positive entities. So they're like ultra-realist in the sense that they think absences really are out there. They're not just in our heads. And these absences cannot be reduced to other things. Okay. So my aim in this presentation is to focus on this single Nyaya thinker, Udayana, who was working towards the end of the 10th century and early 11th century CE. And I want to use Udayana to explore how the Nyaya thinkers actually defend these really strong views. So Udayana himself was quite an influential figure in the history of Nyaya, known for synthesizing the commitments of the Nyaya epistemological tradition, like the Nyaya theory of knowledge, for example, with the ontology and metaphysics of the Vaiśeṣika system. So the Vaiśeṣika thinkers gave a system of what exists and what are the general truths about things that exist, and he tried to synthesize those two traditions. And that was extremely influential because it influenced like philosophers for the next 5 to 7 centuries until the eve of colonialism in South Asia. So in this presentation, I shall look primarily at his Vaiśeṣika work, the Array of Race, Kiranavali, a commentary on an earlier work called the Compendium of the Properties of Ontological Categories, so Padartha Dharma Sangra. And we will see how Udayana defends both realism and non-reductionism about absence. So here's the plan. First, I'll talk about eliminativism about absence, showing how Udayana refutes it and defends realism. Then I'll talk about reductionism about absence, showing how Udayana refutes that and defends non-reductionism. And at the end, we'll talk a bit about the view about absence that emerges, that comes out of that. That's the plan. Okay. Let's start with eliminativism about absence. So imagine two scenarios. First, there's a flower pot on the floor. Then, the second scenario, there is no flower pot on the floor. Pretty simple. So we can accurately describe the first scenario by saying there is a pot on the floor, right? Seems correct. And in the second case, we can say there is no pot on the floor. So what makes the first sentence true? You can say, well, what makes the first sentence true is in fact a positive state of affairs, right? The pot being on the floor. That's what we are talking about. What makes the second sentence true then? One naive answer is that it is, in fact, the pot not being there on the floor. In other words, an absence, right? There's a naive answer. Now, interestingly, if you look at the Buddhist thinkers working within the tradition of this really influential figure called Dharmakirti, 7th century, they actually reject the naive answer, which seems like the commonsensical thing to say about the case. So they argue that absences, in fact, are just conceptual constructions, things we have constructed in our head. Our ordinary talk of absence does not track anything about what ultimately, that is, stands independently, exists independently of our attitudes, beliefs, desires, judgments, and so on. So nothing, strictly speaking, makes the second sentence true. So we do say things like, there is no pot on the floor, but there is nothing out there that makes it true. It's something about us that makes it true. Now, that's a very counterintuitive position in some ways, right? So why do Buddhists actually say this? So one possible argument that seems to sort of play quite a bit of role here is the way the Buddhists themselves think about reality, the way they think about what ultimately exists, what exists independently of our attitudes. So they have two commitments. So first is about what ultimately exists, and the second about the causal inertness of absence. So the first claim is sometimes often in philosophy called the Eleatic principle, because if you look at Plato's The Sophist, there's this figure called the Eleatic stranger who suddenly comes and says that, well, to be is to have causal power, right? Things exist insofar as they causally affect other things in the world. So Buddhists say a similar thing. So they say something ultimately exists independently of our attitudes, just in case it is capable of producing effects. Things have to make a difference to the world to actually exist. If you did not think that, you would be positing a lot of causally idle entities, things that have no effect whatsoever on the course of the world, which seems bad. Like, you should not be doing that. And the next claim is that absences, however, are causally inefficacious. They produce no effects. The only effects that are produced by positive entities, right? Like things that we ordinarily treat as causes are positive events and entities that interact with each other. One problem with this view is that it immediately runs into a problem that we have already sort of glimpsed, I have foreshadowed it a bit earlier. It seems that in both ordinary and theoretical contexts, we acknowledge cases where absences serve as causes. So remember our example, the lack of oxygen supply caused Babel's heart to shut down. Now, there are a bunch of things you could say about cases like that, in fact, our talk of the lack of oxygen supply is like a disguise, like a covert way of talking about other positive entities. It turns out it's extremely hard actually to eliminate the talk of absences from explanations of this kind. If you're interested, ask me later. I'll give you many more examples of where this happens. But the thing that Udayana says is very interesting, and I want to just flag that here. So he says that, look, the Buddhist, what is causation on the Buddhist own picture, right? So for them, for Buddhists of this kind, an actual event, A, is a cause of another actual event or entity, B, just in case A occurs immediately prior to B. That's the first condition. And B would not occur if A did not occur. So there has to be a kind of dependence between A and B. And that's it. Temporal priority plus dependence. That's enough for causation. But the interesting thing, though, is that that kind of dependence and temporal priority can exist between absences and their effects. For example, you might ask, why did Babel's heart shut down? A good explanation of that was that there was no oxygen supply to his heart. So the lack of oxygen supply did immediately temporarily precede Babel's heart failure, and his heart may not have failed or would not have failed if there wasn't lack of oxygen supply. So that if causation is just that, then there's no reason not to treat absences as causes. In fact, Udayana goes on to claim that pretty much in every instance of causation, absences are involved. Absences play a causally indispensable role. So all effects, in fact, according to him, are caused by the absence of preventers. So if a preventer were present, which blocks the ordinary causal process, the effect would not occur. So that is why the absence of preventers is causally necessary for any event to occur. That makes, like, within his picture then, absences have a central role in every instance of causation. So what this shows is that eliminativism about absence, the view on which absences are just mental constructions, not out there, it is untenable. If the only reason for having that view is basically that absences are causally inert, because we can come up with cases where they're not obviously inert. Okay. So we have ticked one box. There are two more to go. Okay. Reductionism about absence. So the reductionist does not say that, well, absences don't exist stance independently. They grant the stance independent, attitude independent existence of absence, but they say that, in fact, these things are reducible to other positive things. So let's go back to our picture. There are these two scenarios. There's a pot on the floor in the first case. There is no pot on the floor in the second. Again, we can ask what makes the second claim true, and the answer will be that it's an absence, the pot not being there on the floor. That was our original naive answer. Now, the Prabhakara Mimamsakas is another group of philosophers. They say that, in fact, this naive answer is true. It is, that second claim is made true by an absence, the pot not being there on the floor. But they argue for reductionism, the view that absences are reducible to other positive entities. And historically, they defend two views. And the first one is like the simplest view that you could come up with. They say that, look, the absence of the pot is not like a thing over and above the surface of the floor itself. It's just the bare floor. So what makes two true, the claim that there is no pot on the floor, is just the floor, the bare floor. That's what makes it true. There's no absence over and above the floor that we need to posit. That's the bare locus view. A slightly different view says that actually that's not all. There is, in fact, a mental component to absence as well. So this other view says that the absence of the pot on the floor is nothing over and above a state of awareness, like an experience, for example, that represents the floor without representing the pot. It's like represents the floor without the pot, essentially. So this is the awareness of just the locus view. Now, Udayana will argue that none of these views actually works, and they're like embarrassing problems for both views. So let's start with the bare locus view. So the person has said, the bare locus view, defender of the bare locus view has said, well, the absence of the pot on the floor is just the bare floor, right? So what does it mean for the floor to be bare or solitary? Right? That's the question. So one option is to say, this is like a non-starter, we'll soon get rid of it, is to say that it is for the floor to be just one thing. The other is to say it is for the floor to be without a second thing. That's what being bare means. Now, the first view is a non-starter because, well, what is it for the floor to be a one thing? One thing. Within Udayana's framework, something is one thing just in case it possesses the number oneness. Like that's his metaphysics. We can worry, it's kind of an absurd view, but we can forget about it for now. But like there's a general moral here which we can extract. So, but the point is that, well, suppose we say that something is one thing just in case it possesses the number oneness. But this number can reside in the floor even when the pot is on the floor. Like the pot being on the floor does not make the floor not one thing. It continues to be one thing. So the picture on which the absence of the pot is just the floor's being just one thing, that's just a non-starter, because the floor can continue to be one thing even when the pot is on the floor. Things can continue to be unitary even when they're accompanied by other things. I can continue to be a one unitary person even when I'm in company, for example. So this is a bad option. Option one is really bad. The more promising option is the second option here, that it is basically for the floor to be without any further thing, without a second thing. But this too is too strong. So think about this. So even when there is something else on the floor, like a cloth, let's say, there may be no pot on the floor, right? So one may correctly assert, even in such a case, that the pot is not on the floor. But in identifying the absence of the pot on the floor with the floor without a second thing, option two predicts that one cannot correctly assert two in such circumstances, when there is something else, not the pot, but something else on the floor. So what option two has done is that it just has misidentified what an absence of the pot on the floor really is. It has made, by saying that it's a bare floor without a second thing, it has said something too strong. Because when there is nothing on the floor, yes, it will be true that the pot won't be on the floor. But even in cases where there is something else on the floor, we can still say correctly that the pot is on the floor. Here's another way of seeing the same problem. So when the floor is without a second thing, right? Not only is it true that there is no pot on the floor, it is also true that there is no cloth on the floor, right? Seems true? Now, according to the second option, the absence of the cloth on the floor is also the floor without a second thing. Now, we have seen the absence of the pot on the floor is the floor without a second thing. We have now seen the absence of the cloth on the floor is the floor without a second thing. So now we have this weird situation where absence of the cloth on the floor is identical to the absence of the cloth on the floor. So whenever we can ascribe the absence of the cloth on the floor, we should be able to ascribe the absence of the pot on the floor, and vice versa. But these are two different absences. Sometimes there might be cloth on the floor without there being a pot on the floor. Sometimes there might be a pot on the floor without there being a cloth on the floor. Those two absences are different absences. So this picture collapses the difference between the two different kinds of absence. Okay. So let's turn now to the second reductionist view, which says that actually it's not the bare locus that is identical to the absence. It's in fact a state of awareness, like an experience that represents the locus, the floor, without representing the thing that is absent. So on Udayana's view, typically we distinguish absences from one another, like the absence of the pot from the absence of the cloth, using two features: the place where the absence is located, their locus, and the entity that is absent. Sometimes philosophers call it counterpositive. You can call it absentee if you want to. So the absence of the pot on the floor is distinct from the absence of the cloth pot in the garden because the loci of the two absences, the places where they are different. One is in the garden, the other is on the floor. Similarly, the absence of the pot on the floor is distinct from the absence of the cloth on the floor because they are absences of different things. The absentees, the counterpositives of the absence are distinct. Okay. Now here's an interesting feature of the counterpositive. If a counterpositive X is present at a certain locus Y, sorry for being too abstract, but I'll explain in a moment. If a counterpositive X is present at a certain locus Y, then its absence cannot be present at that place. So the counterpositive and its absence are incompatible. So here's the way of thinking about it. So go back to our picture, right? Go back to our original picture. Sorry, yes. So here, the thing that is absent here is present on the floor, right? So its absence is not there. Here, in this picture, if we were to bring a pot onto the floor and place it on the floor, the absence would vanish. So absences and the counterpositives are incompatible with each other. They cannot be at the same place at the same time, right? Now, this is the principle that the second reductionist view violates. So the second reductionist view says that, look, the absence of the pot on the floor is just a state of your mind. It's a state of awareness that represents the floor without representing the pot. But presumably, there is no such incompatibility between that state of awareness and the presence of the pot on the floor. Like, for instance, you can imagine a situation where the floor does have a pot on it. Nevertheless, I perceive the floor without perceiving the pot on it. Maybe like the pot is in a corner and I don't see it, for instance, or whatever it is. So in such a scenario, there is just no incompatibility between my state of awareness and the presence of the pot on the floor. But if our principle is right, then there has to be such an incompatibility. And this is pretty much true of any view like this, like even a view, for example, that says that the absence of something at a certain place is nothing over and above, like, say, our talk about that thing. So anything that tries to reduce absence to representation, for example, would have this problem. So what this shows is that neither kind of reductionism, neither the bare locus view, nor nor the awareness of just the locus view is tenable. In general, from that, Udayana draws the conclusion that reductionism about absence is untenable. So far, then, we have looked at two different views about absence and showed how Udayana rejects them, and now the conclusion. So Udayana has argued against two views. The first says that absences are just mere conceptual constructions. They don't exist independently of our attitudes. The second allows for the stance independent of existence of absences, but reduces them to positive entities. But this does not tell us much about what his positive view about absences really is. So for Udayana, absences do exist, and they are not reducible to other positive entities, but they are still dependent entities. So they depend for their existence on the locus, like the floor, and the counterpositive, the thing that is absent. So there can only be the absence of the pot on the floor if there is also a pot, in fact, and the floor. Without those two things, the absence would not exist. And similarly, they also depend epistemically for their own knowledge on these two features. So I can only come to know that there is an absence of a pot on the floor if I independently know of the pot and the floor. So in this sense, both these senses, they are dependent entities. So what does that mean? So one way of thinking about it is this. So suppose God is creating the world, right? So what he does first is creates the positive stuff, which are at the most fundamental level. He creates the basic furniture of the world, and he arranges them in a particular way. That's what, within the Nyāya view, that's what actually God does. Like he has these atoms and he puts them together to create material objects. Suppose that's the view you're working with, right? So at the fundamental level, there's only positive stuff, which are organized in a certain way. But once these positive entities have been assigned certain locations, absences suddenly emerge. Because what happens then is that wherever a positive entity is, anywhere else, its absence will be. And wherever a positive entity is not there, its absence has to be. So the idea is that absences will just emerge out of that more basic arrangement of positive things in the world. And these absences are real and irreducible, but they depend both for their existence and their knowledge on the positive entities themselves. So the lesson: shadows, the lack of oxygen supply, and negligence are all real, but they're real in a different way from objects like chairs and tables or persons like you and me. So, thank you.
Anybody has any questions? Feel free.
Yes.
Thank you. That was lovely. So my question is that, Udayana rejects reductionism about apps. Now, for him, there is no pot on the floor. And so I have two questions regarding this. The first one is that there is also no elephant on the floor.
Yes.
No unicorn on the floor. But it is our mind construct, the expectation of the pot being on the floor.
Very nice.
How would you say Udayana from the Buddhist there? Because
very good. Excellent. Yes.
Sorry, Professor, do you mind just repeating the question for the online audience?
Of course. So there are, I think, two parts of the question, so maybe I will repeat it in that way. So one is that just as in the picture that I was showing, just as there is no pot on the floor, there are lots of other things that are also not on the floor. Like there is no elephant on the floor, there's no unicorn on the floor, and so on. The list goes on. So one diagnosis of why we seem to register these absences has to do with what we are expecting. So if I'm expecting to see an elephant in the room, and then I don't find it, I will notice its absence in the room. So that seems to suggest that absences might, after all, be mental constructions, as the Buddhist would suggest. Did I get it?
yeah.
Okay. So there's a couple of things to say. So I'll first start by tackling the first part of the question about how many absences could there be on the floor. So remember, at the end, I was mentioning that Udayana thinks that absences are dependent entities, right? So he thinks that there can only be absences whose counterpositives for which the absentee object does in fact exist. So in that sense, there could not be absences of unicorns on the floor, strictly speaking. There can be absences, for example, of horns on the heads of horses, but there won't be any absences of unicorns. So that's one thing to say. So he does have like a constraint which restricts the number of absences that can be there at any point of time. Now, you might think that, okay, expectation, but your second observation, again, I completely agree with your point, that expectation often plays a role in our registering absences in our environment, right? But this is also interesting because there are two ways of sort of tackling the mental construction worry from there. The first way of doing it is that there are, however, other absences which we seem to detect without having any expectations whatsoever. For example, if I walk into a room and it's completely dark, I see the darkness without even expecting anything. Like for detecting the darkness, all I need is like lack of stimulation in my sense faculties. I don't, in fact, need to expect light in order to see the darkness. Or when I suddenly notice, for instance, a hole in my teeth, for that, I don't need to necessarily expect a sort of a matter there, which is not there. So there are ways of resisting it in that way. I'm not going to push too hard on that. What I really prefer is slightly different answer, which is that even if expectations do play a role, we are in fact detecting something genuine there. So often the way the role expectation plays is that it draws our attention to certain features of our environment. That's true not just of absences, but also of positive things. For example, if I'm looking for my friend Peter in a cafe, my expectation to see him there might help me detect him faster than it would otherwise do. Similarly, if I'm expecting to see him in the cafe, but he's not there, that will make me register his absence much more quickly than it would otherwise. So the fact that merely expectations play a role in our detection of absence does not show that they're mental constructions, only that we need some help to guide our attention to the right thing.
So it is context dependent.
Yes.
And my second question draws from the same kind of conclusion.
Yes.
But in the modern context of, like in modern science, now that we have the knowledge of quantum physics,
yes,
which is very different from classical physics.
Yeah.
Now, the presence of the pot itself is in question.
Yeah.
Even when it is present.
Yeah.
At that time, when let's say the Buddhist and the Advaitin and Udayana are looking at it together, the Advaitin can take the safe position and say, oh, it'll eventually lead to the Brahman. The Buddhist might then have a point saying that it still does not exist, and because in quantum, because with experiments now, we've experimentally proven that you as the observer makes the pot exist.
Mm.
It is again, it again can be reduced.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. So I don't know enough about like very fundamental particle physics to answer this kind of a question, but I'll try to say a few things. So one thing that like philosophers of physics have pointed to in discussions of causation, for example, that like even in like physical theories that talk about what happens at the subatomic level, like people often talk about like absences of particles doing some work, for example, in explaining physical changes. So the idea is that if you want to give deterministic explanations of, at least, of various physical phenomena, absences will have to play some role in those explanations. Now, I think your point about quantum physics is interesting because there the explanations are not deterministic.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. So, but the tricky thing is that there are also deterministic interpretations of quantum mechanics. Like, so.
Yeah, but then end of the day, then it depends on the observer.
Yes.
And then the Buddhists would say that when it finally depends on the observer, then it is just, it is inside the consciousness.
Yes. But I think the way to think about like what we are doing, I think this is where we have to take a step back and think about what we are doing. So one thought that what people like Udayana are engaged in is that they're not trying to give a theory of what exactly happens at the most fundamental physical level. What they're trying to do is come up with a theory of what the manifest image of the world is like, and give a best explanation of that theory. Now, there is this further challenge of bringing it in line with the scientific image of the world, which emerges from scientific theorizing. And there, he would have to do much more theoretical work than what he has done.
More epistemological view than...
Not epistemological. I think he's trying to give you a theory of what the picture of the world that we are working with ordinarily as we navigate the world. Now, it could turn out that if we have to revise that picture, given scientific theories that have come up. But that's also a sort of a contentious question, because scientists, like philosophers and philosophers of science, don't always agree on how to bring the manifest image of the world in line with the scientific image. Yeah.
So we have one question online. So, does the exploration of absence challenge the Western ontological assumption that to be or existence is primary? And then it goes on to say, are we looking at a fundamentally different metaphysics of non-being here? What can that teach us about how we experience reality in daily life?
That's a great question. So one thing is that at least, so I don't think it's this sort of a theory is completely uncommon, let's say, in European philosophical tradition. But it is definitely a minority view. So the kind of, there are medieval philosophers that talk about lax, for example, but there is also at the same time, amongst at least contemporary people doing metaphysics, a kind of aversion to posit negative entities like absence. So in some ways, this is kind of striking, partly because there is such a large group of philosophers, like the whole of the Nyaya tradition, who are willing to acknowledge the reality of absences. Whereas there are very, very few, like a handful of philosophers working with the European or the contemporary Anglophone tradition who allow for that kind of reality of that kind of negative entity. But if we take these kinds of arguments seriously, what they really draw our attention to is how central absences are to the way we experience the world and how hard it is to get rid of them entirely. So in a way, this is a kind of you might think of this as a kind of a cross-cultural project where you're using the insights from a sort of a historically marginalized tradition to sort of challenge the sort of standing biases of a dominant tradition. So that's the value of doing this kind of work. So I hope that answers the question. Yes?
Thank you for the great talk. My question is, so you said earlier in the talk that something exists because it causes an effect, right? Now, we were talking about number of absences. So there is no part on the floor, but there is also no elephant on the floor. But I wasn't expecting an elephant on the floor. I was only expecting a pot on the floor. So the absence of pot on the floor causes something. It causes me to notice its absence. But the absence of elephant, I don't even notice. It causes no effect. So is it even an absence because it causes no effect in me as an observer?
Yeah.
To that point, my question is, if we fail to notice something that exists, can that be would that be counted as an absence? I go to a party, I didn't notice my friend there. Can I say the friend wasn't there?
Yeah, that's okay. So that's an interesting point. So I think the last part of there are a couple of different things. So one is that the question is whether absences can be causally efficacious even if they are not noticed or not known. And the answer to that is yes. So, for example, think about the heart failure case, right? That's the simplest example. So the lack of oxygen supply causes his heart to shut down. Maybe it took the doctors a bit of time to figure out what caused the person's heart to shut down. So the absence was not known at that point, but it still caused something. So absences can cause things all the time without being noticed. So that's the first part of the second point, which is more interesting, is when can we say something is absent, right? Like merely not noticing something, is that sufficient evidence for saying that the thing is absent? Now, this actually has a connection with the broader debate in both contemporary philosophy of epistemology and philosophy of science and classical Sanskrit epistemology. It's about like when is absence of evidence of absence? So for example, like the American Statistical Association, I think at some point used to sell t-shirts saying that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. As you're correctly pointing out, that's true in many cases. But in some cases, that is in fact, like absence of evidence does count as evidence of absence. So if I go to my friend's house and I search the house thoroughly and I don't find her there, I can definitely conclude that she's not there. But the interesting thing is the other part of my project on Udayana actually is he's very interested in particularly like principles of this kind. And he, especially in the debate about the existence of God, this principle comes up because he has an atheist opponent who says that simply because we don't see God or don't perceive God, that counts as sufficient evidence that God in fact does not exist. And Udayana says, no, that's a bad principle because, well, God could exist without being perceptible. But that creates other puzzles for him because the one problem that arises for him is that, like, in scientific reasoning, we are always relying on inductive generalizations, right? So if I see lots and lots of emeralds, and they all turn out to be green, I can conclude that all emeralds are green. So how do I rule out the possibility that there might be some emerald far away in space and time, which is non-green? So merely the fact that I don't perceive it should not give me evidence that it doesn't exist. But Udayana just said that absence of observational evidence is not evidence of absence. So then Udayana has this problem because he can't explain how we come to know these generalizations. So this is a puzzle which forms a different part of my project on Udayana. But your question is absolutely right on the money. Yes.
So in terms of absence, whether it is the previous view or Udayana's view, has work been done on transposing this to intangible objects or intangible entities? For instance, relationships in the same case like with God, where there is not necessarily observational evidence, so to speak. So there's A and B, two people in a relationship. A believes there is a relationship. B doesn't acknowledge the relationship or understand the existence of it.
Yes.
Then what is absence in that case?
Yeah, I don't think there's anything exactly as specific as that. But Udayana does talk about absences of mental states, for instance, quite expansive. Like he spends quite a bit of time on that, and that's because this is a central topic within the sort of Nyāya-Vaiśeṣika framework that he's working with. So for them, the highest aim of human existence is liberation, like moksha, apavarga, like liberate, which means essentially it's like freedom from all kinds of suffering. Right? So that state is an absence, because it's an absence of all kinds of suffering. The destructive, it's like the absence after the destruction of all kinds of suffering. So Udayana is kind of interested in whether the self can be in a state of that kind, whether like we, the self, can attain a state of that kind. Like, so he spends quite a bit of time arguing that pretty much all of us can be liberated. All of us can achieve that state of freedom from suffering. So that's one place where he's clearly interested, not in just absence of material objects like the pot on the floor, but absence of mental states, which are distressing for us. Yes.
So then what would be the difference between absences and detachment in that particular scenario?
Yeah.
Because a detachment, it seems like moksha, like the idea of letting go of things,
Yes.
is a detachment from. For example, like you're not acknowledging your familiar relationship or whatever it is that exists now on your path to enlightenment, but it cannot be said that you didn't come from this person or that this relationship did not exist.
Yes.
So absence and detachment then kind of become collapsed into each other in some way, you know?
It's an interesting point. So there are a couple of different things. So one is that, yes, it is true that, so Udayana, they often think about detachment itself as a positive attitude. So detachment is not just like the absence of attachment. It's actually a kind of positive attitude of disengaging from things that are harmful for you, according to them. And the thought is that ultimately, like through various kinds of practices, will lead to a situation where the suffering all goes, essentially. But the interesting thing is, like, what is really puzzling about the picture is that really the goal here is not anything positive. For example, someone was talking about the Advaita Vedantas, right? They actually think the goal there in liberation is a kind of a state of bliss. Here it's not bliss. There's no suffering. There is also no happiness or bliss. It's like just becoming a rock, essentially, where there are no conscious mental states. So it's like liberation for Udayana is like a state of complete mental absence, which is the most puzzling feature of this picture. So he tries to defend that against a bunch of objections about like why would someone even care about such a state? And there he basically, his arguments have to do with like how bad like ordinary embodied experience existence is, that we should in fact prefer to be in that kind of. But yes, go ahead.
In that scenario, then does absence become collapsed with emptiness?
Yes. Not emptiness, not in the Buddhist sense, which is slightly different, but emptiness in the sense that you are empty of all ordinary mental states. Yes.
Absence, when we say something is absence, does it or will it relate to limitations of a human capacity, meaning to say ultraviolet light, or we don't able to see the microbes or the blue light onto the electron? It is there. It's just our being human has a limitation, so we don't physically experience or we don't see it, but there are the effects. So it's there, but do we say it is absent?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you might think that even when we are talking about like darkness as absence of light, it's not like in the actual world there is ever total darkness. There's always some photons hanging around. But the point is that often when we are talking about absences in ordinary parlance, we are talking about absence of some sort of salient object. So often when Nyayikas are pushed on this kind of a worry, they say that, well, darkness is just the absence of a particular kind of light, not any light. Similarly, shadows are not absence of all light, but a particular kind of light. So the thought is that if pushed, they will precify their view about absence. But the point is that what we are always tracking, however, no matter how imprecise we are, in ordinary cases in articulating what it is, the absence of which we are sort of which we are noticing, there is some sort of salient thing that we can single out, whose absence we are able to register perceptually and in other ways. It's undeniable, for example, that we can see darkness and shadows, or feel holes and cavities in our teeth and so on.
But then doesn't it become a positive entity?
It doesn't become a positive entity because we are tracking the absence of the salient kind of matter in such cases, not the matter itself.
If the entities are finite, then only you have presence and absence. If the entities are infinite, there is no question of absence at all in the first place.
Why not?
Because if it is, when it is finite, like what you have shown as a pot and no pot.
Yeah.
If the entity is infinite, there is no question of we thinking that it is there or not there.
So suppose I'm looking at a sequence of numbers, and the sequence of numbers starts from, sequence of numbers only has, let's say, 1 to 5, and nothing after that. I can say all natural numbers above 5 are absent on that list. That's an infinite thing.
No, but if you have an infinite object, nothing other than this is not necessarily an infinite object.
But I think we are talking about different. So I think it will depend on which kind of infinity we are talking about. It's pretty obvious that pretty much for like mathematical notions, at least under mathematical notions of infinity.
Mathematical notion, because the moment we say mathematical, it is nothing other than the numbers that we are talking about, right?
But that's the way to think about infinity.
But say an entity which is
In that same, how then to interpret Purnamadaha Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnachyate Namadaya Purnameva.
Well, there are many ways of interpreting. Like Upanishads don't have a single interpretation. Everyone has their own preferred interpretation. The crucial thing, though, is that like Udayana is not a non-dualist, not an Advaita. He does not want to have anything to do with non-dualism. His views are that essentially he allows for infinite number of atoms, for example, in the world. There's no problem with that. The crucial thing is that still does, given as long as they're, let's say, quantifiable in some way, we can still talk about their absences. And there are quantifiable ways of thinking about it, different sizes of infinities, for example. There's no problem there.
We'll take this moment to say that I think that's going to be the end of our Q&A. Feel free to stick around in the room and discuss. We will just be ending the webinar.
Thank you.
No problem.
Thank you for all the great questions.